one of Britain's most prolific serial killers. Over the course of 5 years, during the late 1970s and early 80s, he killed at least 12 men, confessing to as many as 15, the majority of whom have never been identified. Nilsen thought his crimes were simply being flushed from existence by dissecting the bodies piece by piece, boiling them, and then disposing of them down the toilet. But a routine drain inspection at his London home in 1983 would lead to his downfall.
We found a number of interesting items which can only be established once pathologists have examined it.
Are you satisfied that they are in fact human bodies?
This is a possibility, yes.
Dennis Andrew Nilsen was born on the 23rd of November 1945 in Fraserburgh, Scotland. He spent the early years of his life in this house. According to his mother, he was a quiet boy. Little, if anything, marked him out from the ordinary.
After his parents' marriage broke down, he spent the majority of his childhood living in the nearby village of Stricken.
His father was largely absent. He grew up with his mother and his siblings and his grandparents, and his family reformed and his mother remarried. So he had a lot of disruption, he had a lot of chaos. But lots of children have that.
He was isolated from an early age, and the isolation found solace in representations of people who weren't alive, like pictures in a storybook. He'd cut the picture out and take it home. That's what he liked, because that picture couldn't argue with him. It couldn't say no to him.
His mother has actually talked about the way that she would cuddle and have, physical warmth with her other children, but she felt repelled by Dennis. She was quite cold towards him. And this was even when he was just a little child. So right from the beginning, he's learning from his mum that he's different and that he's kind of repulsive in a way.
Due to the absence of his father and the distant relationship with his mother, Nilsen grew particularly close to his grandfather, who worked as a North Sea fisherman.
When he came back from sea, the grandfather would take him down to the beach, and they'd walk up and down the beach, and he'd tell him stories of what happened at sea. His grandfather was the one person he could relate to. This was the one tactile relationship he had, the only person who touched him.
But in 1951, Nilsen lost the one family member that he looked up to the most.
I firmly hold to this view that the death of his grandfather profoundly affected him.
His mother kind of skirted around the topic and said, your grandfather's just not very well and he'll be back. And then when the funeral came around and the body was laid out in the front room of the house, as it often is in these communities at this time, he kind of thought his grandfather was just asleep. So you've got this really traumatic event going on in his life, and he's really struggling to make sense of what's going on. And he's feeling pretty rejected, really, because he's got this really close relationship with his grandfather. One minute he's there and one minute he's not.
I'm utterly convinced that his idea of death and his idea of love were fused at that point. And after that, he could only love people who were dead.
On December the 29th, 1978, he met a 14-year-old boy called Stephen Holmes, and Nilsen knew there was only one way to guarantee his latest lover would never be able to leave him.
Stephen Holmes was a very young boy, and he was trying to get himself something to drink at a pub in Cricklewood. Nilsen offered to help out with the drink and then brought him back to his flat.
Stephen Holmes was never seen again. In a desperate attempt to stop him from leaving, Nilsen murdered the 14-year-old boy by strangling him with a tie before drowning him in a bucket of water. It was the beginning of a familiar pattern for Nilsen.
Essentially, he would frequent the gay pubs and gay bars and would meet men that he found attractive. He would meet men that he wanted to form relationships with, and they would go back to Nilsen's place.
His chosen victims, not necessarily all homosexual, but all vulnerable, I think you could say, or susceptible to somebody offering them a bit of comfort or a meal or a drink or whatever. But he obviously had a tendency to go for handsome young men or people who made themselves available to at least just hang out with him for a while.
But he didn't have the social skills to maintain a normal relationship at a normal pace in a way that wouldn't send people running for the hills. So the only way to keep people there was to kill them.
With Stephen, Nilsen initiated what would go on to become a familiar ritual for him.
The modus operandi of Dennis Nilsen was very similar for most of his victims. They would be plied with drink.
He would have a tie. By the time the victim was now drunk, almost comatose, going to sleep, he would put the tie round his neck and strangle him that way.
And if they were unconscious but not dead, then he would drown them in a bath or a bucket.
After that, he would get himself a drink, light a cigarette, and then spend the next few hours looking after the body.
He would get them out and he would sit and watch television with them. He would clean up the bodies.
He would clean it, dry it, dress it, put it comfortably in a chair. He would speak to the corpse in the chair. These were his pretend friends.
So what we've got going on here, there isn't like massive sexual depravity. What he was creating was a picture of domesticity. He would sit there and watch television with them. So he's killing for company, but in the most grotesque way.
It sounds in many ways like a very dark horror film, the way that he behaved. And I think that was part of the fascination with him, which exists to this day.
Dennis Nilsen's murderous career would continue undetected for 5 years.
I think one of the reasons Dennis Nilsen got away with it for so long was that even at that time, which is post the legalization of homosexuality, the disappearance of young men who were gay was not treated with the same amount of respect and energy as the police, I think, would treat it nowadays.
By February 1983, 37-year-old Nilsen had moved home and was living in a top-floor flat on Cranley Gardens in Muswell Hill, North London. After residents complained about the drains being blocked, a plumber was called in to investigate.
And they found what looked like bits of flesh. Nilsen suggested that it could be somebody had flushed their Kentucky Fried Chicken out or something like that, and that would be the explanation for little bones and flesh.
But the plumber wasn't so sure, and the following morning, February the 9th, 1983, he called the police. Detective Chief Inspector Peter J. remembers that day well.
My phone rang, and it was Peter Slade, the uniform inspector in charge that particular day. And he said to me, "Could you possibly come up here?" He said, "I've got a bit of a problem. I'm not sure what I've got, but I'd like you to see it." And he showed me a drain with an inspection plate cover open. And he pointed out that some bits of flesh had been hauled out of the drain at the bottom. So I said, well, let's have another haul around inside the drain, get anything else that's in there. And the scenes of crime officer that I had with me managed to pull out 3 or 4 pieces of flesh, each about 4 inches long, 1 inch wide, and 3 little bones with a knuckle at each end. And when I looked at them, I thought these bones had probably come from a human hand.
Peter took the remains to Charing Cross Hospital, where resident pathologist Professor David Bowen confirmed their suspicions.
He said it's human, and he said, by pure luck, you've brought me a piece of neck, off the neck, and your victim's been strangled. He said there's a clear ligature mark on this piece of flesh.
Most of us think of hair as being hair, but different parts of the body, the hair is quite different when you look at it down the microscope. And so the pathologist in the Nilsen case was identifying that this piece of skin had hair that fitted with being from someone's neck. So despite the difficulties of fragments of tissue being found in a situation like a drain, identifying the characteristic ligature mark on it, it's pointing you very strongly towards strangulation.
And I looked at him and I said, "You sure you've not been watching too much TV, Prof?" And he said, "No, it's as clear as a bell." He said, "This is human." So that only meant one thing to me, that somebody must have been murdered and flushed down the toilet.
Astounded, Peter drove back to Cranley Gardens and waited outside the flat all day until Nilsen returned home from work.
My first introductory words to him were, "I'm Detective Chief Inspector J from Hornsey Police Station. I've come about your drains." And he looked at me and he said, "Since when have police been interested in blocked drains?" I said, "Well, you take me up in your flat and I'll tell you." And you could smell immediately the decomposing flesh. I said to him, "Look, your drains were blocked with human remains." And he looked at me and he said, "Oh my God, how awful." And I just pushed my face a little bit nearer to his and said, "Don't mess about. Where's the rest of the body?" And he said, "Okay, it's in plastic bags in the front bedroom." Even at that point, his demeanour didn't change at all. He was just as he was when he came in the front door. He was okay. Maybe the game's up. And he was relaxed about it. So we walked him down to the car. I told him I was arresting him. So I drove the car back, and then Steve McCusker was obviously thinking to himself about all the body parts that were in so many different bags. And he popped the question to Nilsen, "Are we talking here about one body or two?" And Nilsen said neither. He said, "I think it's 15 or 16. And I can remember the steering wheel sort of shaking in my hands.
It was a case that spanned 2 decades. By the time Peter Tobin was found guilty of murdering teenage hitchhiker Dinah McNichol in 2009, he'd already been in prison for 2 years. He was serving life sentences for the murders of Angelica Kluke and 15-year-old schoolgirl Vicky Hamilton. The 63-year-old serial killer and rapist had buried all 3 girls across a 15-year period, 1 in Scotland and 2 on the south coast of England.
Another awful discovery at 50 Irvine Drive. A body bag thought to contain the remains of Dinah McNichol, brought out from what was the most ordinary of houses. It is no longer.
I think what sets Tobin apart for me is the sheer relentless brutality of him. A man who genuinely paid no attention whatever to anything but his own basest instinct. He did what he wanted, when he wanted, and could get away with it.
Former Detective Superintendent David Swindle from Strathclyde Police first came across Tobin after the body of Angelica Kluke was discovered at St Patrick's Church in Glasgow in 2006. The 23-year-old Polish student had been missing for 5 days.
Coming back to the church today brings it all back to me. The horrors of what must have happened here. Unbelievable. You could never imagine it. A place of worship desecrated by Peter Tobin doing what he did to Angelica Kluke.
But when they arrested Tobin, police were convinced this wasn't his first murder. David set up Operation Anagram, a task force charged with finding out more about the life and crimes of Peter Tobin.
When we looked at his life in Operation Anagram, we found that he frequented places like this: churches, religious establishment, homeless persons, hostels. How many people frequented the places that Tobin frequented? How many people did he meet that were vulnerable at that time, that had no relatives to report them missing? How many of these were missing and were never reported missing that Tobin has killed? We'll never know. Tobin knows the answer.
Throughout his life, Tobin, who was born and brought up a Catholic, had a persistent connection with the Catholic Church, and at various points during his periods on the run or disappearing or adopting false identities, took refuge in Catholic churches and Catholic communities. I think it was simply that was somewhere where he felt comfortable, where he knew how to conduct himself, where he could hide in plain sight. He could conceal his true nature behind the facade of a church handyman or a member of a Christian community. And that was a very safe way to conceal the reality of what he wanted.
To Tobin, nothing was sacred. He took advantage of the open nature of the Currans and the community of St Patrick's.
He was with us maybe about 6, 7 weeks, something like that. And then he started giving Father Jerry a hand in the church, and he's doing bits and pieces. People don't understand. You can be with somebody a full day and they never spoke. You know what I mean? People find that hard to understand. There was nothing to sort of, it was a yes and no. That's what it was, a yes and a no.
Peter Tobin was an incredibly manipulative individual. He wasn't particularly emotionally complex himself, but he had a really good understanding of other people's emotions. He knew what other people needed to hear, and he used that to get what he wanted.
Kathy, however, had concern for the ominous stranger who joined their community.
I says to Dennis that there was something far wrong with him. I wasn't too sure what it was, but as far as I could understand, that the jigsaw with Pat McLaughlin was no fitting together. There was something not right there.
But Tobin's next step was more evil than any of them could have predicted. Angelika Kluk was a 23-year-old student from Skotzau near Krakow in Poland who was working as a cleaner in St. Patrick's Church. On the 24th of September 2006, she disappeared. Dennis broke the news to his wife.
He said, that girl, Angelika Kluk, we don't know where she is. And I went, what do you mean? He said, she's vanished. All her stuff's there, all her credit cards and everything are all up in their room, but she's vanished.
Police scoured the church and grounds for evidence and began interviewing members of the community. They discovered that the last person seen with Angelika was the church handyman, a man named Pat McLaughlin. Charity worker Dennis provided police with a photograph of McLaughlin.
At 6 o'clock it went in the evening news nationwide, and within minutes their phone line was jammed to say that's not Pat McLaughlin, that's Peter Tobin.
Police now had their main suspect. They quickly discovered that Tobin had a violent past, and the investigation escalated at rapid speed. David Swindle was the lead detective on the case.
I became involved in the investigation when it was established that Peter Tobin, a missing sex offender, had been with Angelika Kluk. And soon after my involvement, I arranged for the church to be searched again by specialist officers and specialist teams.
There's a garage attached to the church, and that is where Peter Tobin was with Angelika Kluk, working on some woodwork.
He called her his little apprentice. He actually was interviewed by a police officer when the missing person report was made, and he stayed there for another day, and when the heat was on, he left. When he realised it was being treated as a major investigation, he left. This is someone that was cool and calculated.
Police launched a nationwide search for Peter Tobin.
Mr. Tobin is considered a potential risk to members of the public. Any person who sees this man is advised not to approach him.
It was a name that sounded all too familiar to crime journalist Martin Brunt.
It was a shock to find what had happened, but what made it particularly interesting for crime reporters who were covering the case was that police were appealing for a man called Peter Tobin, and it rang bells. It took me and others back to the days of 1993. They didn't realise that he was, in reality, Peter Tobin with a dreadful history of sex crimes. He was a man hiding in that community under a false name, had duped the church authorities to employ him as a handyman, and of course they were completely innocent of his background.
As the search for Angelika intensified, it became more and more likely she wouldn't be found alive.
We had another search of the church, a really thorough search, because by this time the parameters had changed. There was concern for her safety.
5 days after her disappearance, on the 29th of September 2006, police discovered the body of Angelika Kluk under the floorboards of St. Patrick's Church. She'd suffered severe head injuries and multiple stab wounds after being attacked in the adjoining garage.
It was in there just after the priest, Father Jerry, left on that Sunday. Within minutes of it, someone across the road had heard a scream.
He hit her over the head with a table leg. There was splinters in her head, rendered her unconscious or semi-conscious, bound her hands with cable ties, further assaulted her, dragged her in a polythene sheet into the church here and across the church, and put her body under the floor like a bag of rubbish. She was put under there. He stabbed her, whether that happened underneath there or whether it happened outside, and he raped her. He left her dead.
The British public was shocked to learn the truth of where Angelika's body had been hidden since her violent death.
This should have been a day of worship here at St Patrick's Church, but instead the building remains a crime scene, sealed off and guarded by police. And today brought the news that the people who laid those floral tributes were expecting but dreading that the body found hidden underneath the floorboards here was indeed that of the missing Polish student.
I think the discovery of Angelika's body was awful enough that a young woman had died in those circumstances. The fact that she was buried under a church added some sense of horror and drama to the way people reacted to it. The fact that a suspect was somebody who had been working at the church, somebody who seemingly had volunteered to be a handyman at the church, didn't really make sense.
DNA evidence on Angelika's body was confirmed as belonging to Peter Tobin, and his fingerprints were found on the tarpaulin he used to wrap her in.
In forensic pathology, we have what's called Locard's exchange principle. That says that when you interact with another person, you leave something of yourself on them and you take something of them away with you. Anyone who murders another person, who physically interacts with them, they will leave trace evidence. They will leave DNA, potentially fibres, hairs, all sorts of things.
But Peter Tobin continued to elude the authorities. Despite a nationwide search, he disappeared into thin air.
So things were moving very fast. We have the human remains of a young woman who's been ferociously attacked. Horrible, horrible scene underneath the floorboards. Forensic examination is ongoing. We knew by this time that Peter Tobin had a history of violence, sexual crimes. He had been in prison. He was a dangerous person. Where was he?
David and his team wouldn't have to wait long for an answer. In early October, just over a week since Angelika's murder, they received a crucial breakthrough. Tobin had been spotted, this time using another alias, James Kelly, over 400 miles away.
We got a phone call from the police in London that he'd checked into a hospital in a false name. Someone had recognised him. A Metropolitan police officer went in there and confirmed his identity. And I arranged for a team of uniform officers to bring him back to Scotland.
Sinclair was born in Glasgow in the post-war years, and this was a time of real change and real upheaval for the city. There was a lot of poverty and there was quite a significant gang culture, so violence was part and parcel of everyday life for many young men.
Angus had two older siblings, a brother and a sister, but this didn't stop him from being picked on.
He was the runt of the litter, but he was also small. By the time he'd reached puberty, he was constantly being bullied, knocked about, thrown about.
Tragically, Sinclair's father died when he was just 4 years old.
I think that certainly increased his feeling of depression, of being an outsider, of not being like everybody else. And he chose to identify with petty theft and petty crime as his revolt against the world.
In 1959, when Sinclair was just a young teen, he committed his first offence.
He was only 13 when he stole the offertory box at the local church, and that led to him having a criminal conviction.
At the same time, he became preoccupied with sex.
Now, the early sexualisation of young men is a clue to problems later on. And we start to see this pattern in Angus Sinclair.
By the age of 15, Sinclair's bad behaviour escalated and became increasingly violent. He viciously attacked an 8-year-old girl.
If there was a trigger to the career that he then went on to found as a rapist and a murderer, 1961 was probably the moment in which it started, because later in the year, he committed the first serious attack on a neighbour, young girl, lived nearby.
On July the 1st, Sinclair was home alone when he decided to strike again. This time, the victim was a child who lived in a neighbouring flat in the tenement block, 7-year-old Catherine.
He's 16 at the time, and there's quite a lot of respect amongst children for older children. So he asks her to run an errand for him, and she goes out and she does it. Now, when she comes back, he attacks her.
Sinclair took the girl up to his flat, where he viciously assaulted her. Then, in the middle of his heinous act, he suddenly stopped.
There's a knock at the door, and he just literally stops what he's doing and goes and answers the door and sends the neighbour away.
Sinclair got rid of the visitor and went back to attacking the girl. He raped her, he killed her using a ligature from a bicycle in a bicycle tube. It's a vicious, premeditated, calculating, callous attack on an utterly innocent young girl.
The callous killer quickly came up with a plan to dispose of the child's body.
I think most 16-year-olds would panic, but what he did was he sorted out her lower clothing to try to hide the fact that it had been a sexual attack. He rolled her body down the stairs and he left it there to be found, obviously hoping that it would look as though she had fallen downstairs and injured herself.
Left at the bottom of the communal staircase inside the tenement block, Catherine was quickly found by neighbours. By the following day, she was confirmed dead. Forensic testing was still in its infancy at the time, but with such key evidence, scientists hoped their analysis could help pinpoint the killer.
Now, blood grouping on these materials should be fairly straightforward when it's that fresh, but it actually proved quite difficult to get good, clear results on, so we had to kind of abandon those results. We weren't able to get terribly clear results on that.
Scientists at the time could not help the police find the culprits, now branded the World's End killers by the press. Lester Knibb and the team at the lab held on to the samples in the hope that future advancements in forensic technology would later solve the case.
Relatively early in 1978, that the police kind of drew a close. We produced a report, an interim report, to keep the police up to date with what we'd found. And effectively all the exhibits were taken away for storage by the police.
But just over a year after the World's End murders, Sinclair struck again. On November the 19th, 1978, he was prowling near Barnhill Station in the suburbs of Glasgow. There he spotted a target, a petite 17-year-old machinist called Mary Gallagher.
Mary Gallagher was in her late teens, but the significant thing about Mary is that she was tiny. She looked like a child.
Mary Gallagher was going to meet her friend over the other side of the railway tracks, and her mother saw her set out, her sister saw her set out as well.
Mary was last seen leaving her home at 6:45 p.m.
Sinclair threatened Mary with a knife. He demanded that she took her clothes off, and he slit her throat with a knife. This was a really, really nasty attack.
It would take more than 20 years to prove that Sinclair was Mary's killer. Meanwhile, he continued to commit a catalogue of cruel offences.
One of the extraordinary things about Sinclair was known to the police. He had a reputation as a mugger. At one point, he got a handgun conviction. They knew he was a violent man, but they didn't connect the dots. Sinclair was a man who got away with it for a very long time.
Between 1978 and 1982, a total of 11 children reported being sexually assaulted by Sinclair.
Over a number of years, we think exclusively targeted children because there aren't any unsolved rapes or rapes and murders of that time from about 1978 to 1982 that match his MO.
Sinclair would ask them to run an errand for him, and then when they returned, he would attack them.
Sinclair used his job as a painter and decorator as cover for his despicable deeds. In 1982, Sinclair was finally caught out. In June, Sinclair was in the Woodlands area of Glasgow, where he assaulted a 6-year-old girl. But this time, the alert child was able to identify her attacker.
One girl, 6-year-old girl, who he carried out a really serious sexual assault on, recognised the smell of turpentine on him. He was dressed as a painter and flecks of paint were on his hair and shoes.
Sinclair, now aged 37, was arrested and subsequently stood trial at Edinburgh's High Court. On August the 31st, 1982, he was convicted of 3 charges of rape, 7 charges of lewd and libidinous practices, and a breach of the peace.
The Crown decided to take a very, very simple approach to the case. They decided not to bother with all the supporting evidence, the hairs and fibres, the knots, nothing like that. They decided just to go on the simple, straightforward DNA. Here is a girl that's been murdered. Here is her coat. On that coat is DNA, and the DNA belongs to Angus Sinclair. End of story.
Sinclair and his lawyers saw a chance to deny the murder.
Eventually, in 2004, the DNA evidence points conclusively to Sinclair as part of the World's End killings. Sinclair stands trial, but comes up with what to him, I'm sure, seemed a perfect defence. Oh, yes, this DNA proves I had sex with Christine and Helen after the World's End. But of course it was entirely consensual, and when I left them with my brother-in-law Gordon, they were alive and well, and as far as I was aware, in fine spirits. It was all Gordon's fault. That was his defence.
Sinclair's testimony was enough to prove reasonable doubt.
The judge decided that because of the suggestion of consensual sex, then that the whole of the DNA evidence which was being put forward by the Crown was no longer relevant. None of the supporting evidence had been included by the Crown, and therefore the case fell in 2007.
Without any other forensic evidence, Judge Lord Clark threw the case out.
It was one of the worst days of my life. I mean, I can remember it distinctly yet. It was just this sense of total disbelief.
The families of Helen and Christine had been waiting 30 years for justice. Helen Scott's father was there that day.
Absolutely shattered. Words can't explain how I feel. 30 years of trying to get a conclusion.
The decision also sent shockwaves across Scotland.
When the trial collapsed, a lot of journalists, politicians, and significantly the Lord Advocate themselves, who's in charge of all prosecutions in Scotland, said, "Whoa, stop. Something about this isn't right." And that started a pretty root and branch review of the justice system, particularly when it comes to double jeopardy.
Scotland was one of the last countries in Western Europe to have a law that stated you could not be tried for the same crime twice. It was overhauled in the wake of the 2007 trial.
So the law changed, and then Angus Sinclair was the first person to be retried under the double jeopardy legislation.
When the go-ahead for the second trial was given, I came out of the court and I phoned my dad straight away to tell him it wasn't about celebrating. None of this has ever been about celebrating, but what it did do was just give that opportunity to bring this chapter to an end.
On the 13th of October 2014, 69-year-old Angus Sinclair stood trial again for the murders of 2 17-year-old friends, Helen Scott and Christine Eadie. This time, the Crown prosecutors used all the latest forensic technology to make their case.
The trial lasted weeks. I attended every day, and this time the Crown got it absolutely right. I mean, there was compelling evidence from knots to soil samples to DNA, just a whole picture was put together. Exactly what should have happened in 2007 and didn't. And the jury convicted him unanimously. There was no question whatsoever.